So when we're talking about things like social justice, we also need to talk about how social justice is accomplished. And so what this lecture is going to focus on is going to focus on this thing called social movements and direct action. And we're going to be doing it with the kind of a special focus on your reading from Martin Luther King and his letter from a Birmingham jail. And so social movements like social justice is probably one of those terms that you've heard many times before, but have never really kind of heard a great definition for. And so what this lecture is going to do is it's going to really kind of give you sort of a framework to understand social movements from, and to understand a little bit of Martin Luther King and who he was, and kind of trying to fold that into this understanding of what social movements actually are. And so just for a quick review, in your last lecture we talked about social justice, and that this idea that groups that label themselves as social justice organizations are usually saying that they focus on one or more of the following characteristics: full and equal participation, equal distribution of resources, that all members are physically and psychologically secure, self-determination, and interdependence. And so what social movements are the ways in which groups try to realize these goals. And a social movement basically has four features. One is its aims, or another word for that would be its goals. And that is the alteration of social and cultural values. So basically, social movements are trying to get the public to question its values around stratification in particular, and the ways in which different people are affected by stratification and why we have come to normalize that. There's also the issue of the social base. So social movements are usually based on groups of people who position themselves outside of social class. And so what that means is that's kind of a fancy way of basically saying that it's the people who are on the receiving end of social stratification, so those people most oppressed by it, that lead the movement. So a racial justice movement is going to be led by people of color, right? A women's rights movement is going to be led by women. The means of action. And so what this is that social movements really focus on a mass mobilization of people that operate outside the system. So you'll hear people say sometimes that they want to create social change, but they want to do it from the inside. They want to get maybe elected to office, or they want to become a lobbyist and work in the White House, or they're going to create change in the system from within the system. Many people do make certain changes successfully with that, but that is actually not a social movement. A social movement is a mass mobilization of people, which means that it's collective. That element of interdependence and social justice. Social movements are collective actions. They are collective groups of people coming together, and they're operating outside the system. And related to that is the ways in which social movements are organized. They tend to be loose and flexible in their methods, and involve ordinary everyday people over formal bureaucracy. So for example, it's not the politicians who are going to create this social change or who are going to lead social movements. It's going to be the voters who lead social movements. It's going to be the people on the ground at the grassroots who are really kind of living it every day. Those are the people who create social movements. And over formal bureaucracy also means that these are people who are not going to be using the means of bureaucracy in order to create social change. They're actually going to be trying to work around that and even subvert it. And the ultimate goal of a social movement is knowledge production. Social movements are knowledge producers, which means they produce a language to discuss particular issues. A common critique that you might hear of social movements is that they don't actually in themselves create social change. And that's true and not true. It's true in the sense that that's not the ultimate goal of a social movement. The social movement itself doesn't create social change. It's about changing social and cultural values. Remember the aims. So it's creating a language for people to have critical, meaningful discussions about social movements. So we are the 99% from the Occupy Wall Street movement. That was knowledge production. That was giving a language to talk about wealth inequality. Black Lives Matter. That's knowledge production. That's creating a language to talk about violence against Black lives. Mini-Wee-Coney, Water is Life, which came out of the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. That's knowledge production. That's a language to talk about the links between tribal sovereignty and climate justice. That is what social movements ultimately do, is they produce knowledge. There are individual organizations, because remember, a movement is a loosely connected network of people and groups, right? So there are groups within that are looking for specific systemic change. So in Seattle, for the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, you have groups like EPIC and the Prison Industrial Complex, which has been one of the central leaders in the No New Youth Jail campaign. Right, so that's a specific organization within this umbrella of Black Lives Matter, the movement. Which means that the ultimate goal of a social movement is questioning the legitimacy of the state and state violence. That in trying to create this knowledge, create this language to alter people's social and cultural values, social movements are primarily trying to get people to question what they have considered as either normal or what they have maybe never really stopped to think about. And in not thinking about that, that is also granting legitimacy to the state and to state violence. And so social movements are trying to create a critical conversation around that. And just to clarify what I mean by state violence, I really mean structural violence in a nation state. And so it's looking at power, and we've talked about power when we talked about disciplinary regimes and what power looks like and how power is involved and is enforced, and also the use of violence, which in the most general sense just means causing harm, right? That when you have the power, when the nation state uses its power to cause harm to groups of people, that is an act of structural violence, when the state and violence come together. And this could mean physical violence, so like police brutality or sticking your military on your people, right? That could be physical violence. But it could also mean causing harm in other ways. So for example, housing displacement, gentrification, the rising costs of housing without thinking about how the poor might be affected by that, and then they have to leave their homes, right? Or in Seattle, the homeless encampment sweeps that we've had over the past year, where these homeless encampments, those tents that you see along the freeways, get swept and eliminated, right, without any sort of recognition of where are homeless people going to go now. So they've suddenly been stripped of the only form of housing that they have. That's causing them harm. And it's state-sanctioned harm. So when those two come together, what you have is structural violence. And so what social movements try to do is to create a language to have a meaningful critical dialogue about structural violence. And there's various types of social movements. There's kind of three overall types of social movements. And what really kind of encompasses how these types of social movements is, one is looking at who the change is for and the scope of the change. So who benefits from the change and how much change are you looking for? And so the three types are basically liberal social movements, progressive social movements, and radical social movements. And all three of these differ in their level of change and who that change is supposed to be for. So a liberal social movement is looking for change for a specific group of people, and I'm going to focus on gender for this to kind of give you some examples, is looking for specific groups of people with limited change, which means you're not necessarily looking to create any significant structural changes within a society. You kind of want to keep that structure intact. You're just trying to find ways to make a specific group of people equal to the person who kind of dominates in a socially stratified society. So, for example, a lot of women's liberation movement focused on the 1960s, focused on women in the workplace and women being able to be equally promoted in the workplace and to be able to work at all, right? That was really kind of framing gender inequality as being equal to men. There's no real kind of questioning of capitalism and the links between capitalism and patriarchy, but really just that how do we put more women at the top of this hierarchy? Gay marriage would be another example, right? There's not really a critical discussion of the institution of marriage. There's not really a larger kind of scope of how much change we want for a really kind of truly just society of LGBTQ people, but just that this specifically the right to marriage is this kind of single issue. And that really can really kind of encompass what a liberal social movement is focusing on one specific issue and maybe trying to kind of change a policy around that. And so progressive social movements kind of take it a step up. Right? They're looking for change for everybody, and they are looking for some sort of restructuring, right? So they might see the system that we have now as kind of like a skeleton of something that could be workable, and it just needs to be restructured a bit, and it's looking for change for everybody. Right, so what a progressive movement, if we're going to focus on gender again, rather than looking at single issues like work equality or marriage equality or things like that, progressives are starting to kind of question what we even mean by gender and gender roles and gender as a social construct, and what do we need to do to really kind of restructure society in a way that's more inclusive of everybody. And so restructuring might be something like the restrooms, like the gender neutral restrooms, the push for gender neutral restrooms, right? This is creating a really kind of critical dialogue about why we have gender specific restrooms. So why do we have one restroom for men and another restroom for women? And what are the implications of that? And what does that say about how we define gender and the limitations of how we define gender? And why I say that that's everyone and not a single issue is that even though transphobia has been the way that we kind of justify gender-specific restrooms, gender-neutral restrooms benefit lots of people. It benefits people who have children with disabilities that are a little bit older, right? So like a mother who finds her son needing a public restroom, right, and who needs a lot of supervision, now doesn't have to figure out what she's going to do in order to get her child to the restroom, right? So progressive social movements kind of try to restructure to kind of create something a little bit more equitable for everybody. And then even a step up for that, radical social movements are about everybody and about radical social change. And it's this idea that the very system itself needs to be dismantled and rebuilt into something else. And so Martin Luther King, for just a little biography on him, he was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He's a Baptist minister and a prominent figure in the civil rights movement and the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was probably one of the most influential in the end of Jim Crow segregation in the United States. And he was assassinated in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. And the reason that I kind of want to focus on social movements, and the next lecture video will be getting deeper into this, kind of a part 2 of the social movements lecture, is because Martin Luther King is really kind of his radical roots often kind of get left out of the kind of historical narrative of his legacy. And so what I want to do is use this letter to really kind of give some insight into what Martin Luther King envisioned as social change.